Chapter 18. A Racket. Stosh and I stood in the doorway, and I felt my mouth drop wide open. The inside was so beautiful. Extraordinary, actually. Stasha prodded me, and I limped into a wide hallway. Power must have also heated the mansion, as toasty warmth immediately seeped into my body and restored my soul. At least it felt like that after so many straight hours in utterly freezing weather. My feet sank into a thick red carpet with dazzling gold swirls that curled along it. Stasha closed the door behind us with a soft click. Bright, unwavering light exuded from bulbs and sconces that lined both sides of the hall, which made all the corridors' brilliant colors jump out and dazzle my eyes. Amazing, I murmured. Agreed. Stasha's mouth hung open as she looked around. We slowly headed down the hallway, the fire poker rigid against my side, though by now I was used to it. Even though I limped, I tried to carry myself as naturally as possible, like I'd been working there all my life, and was just going about my daily business, strolling from one end of the manor to the other. A series of the most gorgeous chairs I'd ever seen lined both sides of the hallway. They had to be made of mahogany, with no nicks in them and with priceless plush red seats. Their backs leaned against the walls. Every once in a while a different structure rested against the wall too, like a wooden stand that supported a jewel-encrusted vase full of purple flowers so vivid it seemed like they'd imprinted themselves on my eyes. Even the stand had a series of glistening red jewels engraved in it across the top part. I had to tear my gaze away from the mesmerizing sight as I walked by. On one section of the wall hung an incredible painting as vibrant as the flowers. It portrayed a mountainside view of a massive body of deep blue water that seemed to stretch on forever into the distance. Had to be the ocean, which I'd learned about in my nurture faction. All I could do was stare at the painting. In my imagination I soared across the water, trying to find the end of its eternal length. I ripped my gaze away from the VO. Funny how just 5 minutes ago I would have tried to calculate or imagine how many prestige points these incredible objects were worth. Had to have been gazillions. But now I knew they weren't worth any points. Actually, when it came down to it, they were flat out priceless. If I had the time, I would have just stood there and stared at all of them for hours, maybe even the rest of my life. Chud probably would have too if he had the chance, but I had a job to do, a paramount job. Maybe the most paramount job in the history of Middleton. It sounded like Stasha squeezed words through a narrow gap between her teeth. Appears the Badalux family has not only retained all the finest VOs with no intent on ever sharing them with the rest of us, but they aren't even studying or preserving them either. Good points. But what else was new with Stasha, or the rulers for that matter? Yeah, looks like they're just using them to decorate their home. An edge had crept into my voice too. The lies just kept growing, and if this was just the hallway that connected the garage, then I couldn't even begin to imagine all the other extraordinary VOs that must have been lying around the manor. Although if that was true, I don't get it. When the rulers give the so-called winning faction a tour of the mansion every year, wouldn't it be obvious to them what the rulers are really doing with the VOs? Stasha fiddled with her hair. I'd imagine the Badalux family wouldn't give them a tour throughout the entire manor. Perhaps there's an area, a whole wing even, they've designated to look like a colossal VO storage or study room. Maybe even show the winning faction the garage. One thing's for certain, they'd never keep the most impressive VOs in such an area. I shrugged. Probably not. We've got to get moving, find a grown-up, and somehow freeze an image of them. I'd freeze one of this corridor first. It can't hurt. Quickly, before somebody comes. I pulled the camera from my pocket, clicked an image of the hall, and shoved the camera back into my pocket as fast as I could. We continued down the hallway until we came to a door on the right side. Hold on a sec. I pressed my ear against it, heard fluttering in my chest. Doesn't sound like anyone's in there. We moved to a door farther down the hall, and I pressed my ear against that one too. Again, nothing. I tried the third door, this one on the left side of the hallway. There's lots of noises coming from behind this one, I said, including voices. Stasha pushed her ear against the door too, and her lips parted slightly. Agreed. Should we open it and see what's going on? Might as well, that's why we came here. Her face grew a shade paler, and I'd bet 1,000,000 prestige points mine did too. I reached out a shaky hand and opened the door. In front of us, a wooden staircase curved down out of view. The basement, Stasha murmured. The noises and voices gusted up the stairs pretty loudly, though I couldn't tell what caused them all. Sounded like some kind of jungle down there. Even music joined the racket, a backdrop to the madness. For a moment we just stood there and listened. The only time we'd ever heard music was at the annual Flag Day, when the Bad Lucks family played a song on a large ancient thing called a boombox. It was called the Middleton Anthem, and the rulers had made it somehow. No one knew how, but I always figured they'd used VOs, since I'd found some out in town that made some pretty weird noises when you blew into them, or stroked them with your fingers. Maybe the rulers froze the song they made with some other VO, just like how you could freeze images with the camera. What in the name of the Bad Lucks family is going on down there? Stasha snapped me out of my thoughts. I don't know. Maybe some kind of special ceremony? Shall we? I nodded, though neither of us moved. After a moment I started down the stairs, which were well lit, thanks to more sconces on the walls, but my legs threatened to lock with each step. What had I gotten us into? For a second I imagined us turning around, going back up the steps, out the garage, out through the gate, through the suburbs, and back to the farmhouse again. We'd look just like mansion servants too, so none of the citizens by the gate or in the streets would think twice as we slipped by. Then again, if the actual manor servants all knew each other, maybe they'd easily be able to tell we weren't one of them. I hadn't thought of that. Maybe we should head back now, before it was too late. I shook my head and gritted my teeth. No, Stasha and I had to do this. This could be Middleton's only chance for something better. The jumble of random noises and music grew louder and pounded into my skull. A few more magnificent paintings with rich, colorful paint. They depicted people, objects, and different landscapes, adorned parts of the wall. I forced my feet to keep going down. Finally, the stairs opened into a huge carpeted room, and it took all my willpower not to gasp. Gigantic square objects. Everything was so huge in this priceless place, had been propped against every wall of the room. At first I didn't recognize them, but I'd definitely found a few much smaller ones when I'd been out in town supply hunting, except the fronts of those were always totally black. The fronts of these were bright and full of color, not to mention filled with what looked like actual people in foreign places, but they couldn't be real. No way, because they stayed inside the squares and kept moving and changing. I could have sworn the music and some of the random noises came from the giant square objects too. A large plush circular couch was in the middle of the room, and 4 grown-ups either lay or sat on it, each focused on one of the giant squares. The adults wore clothes that were mostly wrinkle-free. One of them, a woman, had on a beautiful silk dress, a large pair of gold earrings, and a silver necklace with an elegant heart-shaped gem on it. I'd never seen such incredible objects. I found myself leaning forward to get a better look. A couple men sat on the couch. They also wore striking suits even fancier than mine and Stasha's, one a light blue color and the other dark green. All the grown-ups were older than the ones we'd seen at the funnel-shaped building, since their faces had a few wrinkles on them and their hair had sporadic gray specks in it. 2 men held objects that had wires attached to them, which in turn were connected to one of those Nintendo objects. It sat by one of the giant square devices the men were looking at, and a cord ran from it to the wall. The men feverishly clicked the buttons of the small devices in their hands, gleams of sweat on their foreheads. Suddenly, the man in the dark green suit threw up his arms and shouted, "Yeah, baby!" He laughed so hard his face grew a pink tinge. Won by a scratch. Whew, that was a close one. The man who sat next to him sagged into the couch. His features drooped. I looked at the giant square they gazed at and started. Holy power! The device framed an extremely realistic, muscled green monster that stood on 2 legs like a human. It waved its beefy arms high in the air, like the younger man just did. Blood, had to be fake, was splattered over random parts of its body. What an amazing image. So realistic. "Wow, no way," Stasha murmured. "What?" I asked. "It's a game," she said quietly so nobody else could hear over the noise. "Those 2 men are playing an advanced game, and the other 2 are simply being entertained by looking at the other mechanisms." I dragged my gaze to the 2 other adults, one of them, the woman, who lay on the couch and just stared at separate gigantic squares where different images moved. A small rectangular device similar to the one by the large square that showed the green monster rested at the foot of each of those squares too. Stasha was right. Nobody was studying these crazy objects. The 2 who played the advanced game were competing, which was even more obvious now that they feverishly clicked the devices in their hands and shouted when one of the figures portrayed on the giant square punched or kicked the other and drew splatters of blood. The grown-ups who just watched the giant square VOs were slouched in their seats. One of them chuckled, even though none of the other adults said anything. They were all shooting the breeze, having fun. In fact, they were having so much fun, they hadn't even noticed Stasha and I were there. As though she just realized this, Stasha grabbed my hand and pulled me into a nearby room, which was filled with more giant squares, fancy devices, and comfortable-looking couches. Nobody else was in the room, the squares' faces black. We probably could have turned them on by hitting a button, though, since they had to have power. How many entertainment rooms did this manor have? I clutched my stomach with both hands. It had gone from fluttering with fear and excitement to so nauseous I was sure it would start to erode before long. All this time, I could barely push the words out. All this time, the rulers have been collected precious VOs, not just to preserve them because they were priceless remnants of the old world, not even just to decorate their home, but for their own sick entertainment. I hunched over as bile threatened to come up. This time I didn't even care Stasha was there. It was all just too much. She put her hand on my back and my stomach calmed down a bit. This appears to be correct, but we must get moving if we're to thwart the rulers. I stood, trying to push the sickening realization from my head. You're right. Do you think the grown-ups will notice if we take their picture, like right now? They scarcely noticed when we were there. I'd say it's worth an attempt. Okay, let's do it. I clenched my hands together real tight, then walked back into the noisy room. Good. The adults were still glued to their entertainment VOs. I reached into my pocket, grasped the camera, and was just about to remove it when the woman glanced in my direction. I froze.